Hello, and welcome to another teaching from 2536. Today we're going to explore a single verse from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Galatians. It's within this verse that Paul reveals the true impact of the death and resurrection of Christ. That verse is Galatians 3:19, which reads, "What purpose then does the law serve? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was appointed through angels by the hand of a mediator." Now, in order to properly reconcile Galatians 3:19, we need to gain the education Peter warns is necessary. Otherwise, we might twist Paul's writing, along with some of the other scriptures, to our own destruction by being carried away into the error of lawlessness. And a critical part of that education is understanding the events at Mount Sinai, because a large portion of Paul's letter to the Galatians reference these events, especially verse 19. So let's go through this verse item by item. Paul begins by writing, "So what purpose does the law serve?" So before we can move on, we need to know what law Paul is referring to. And fortunately, he gives us the answer earlier in verse 10. So let's take a look. "For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, as it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law.'" So the law Paul is referring to is the book of the law. So if we paraphrase, not adding or taking away from anything Paul actually wrote, but just to provide clarity, we could say, so what purpose does the book of the law serve? Paul then continues by writing, "It was added because of transgressions." This phrase poses several questions. The first of which, since we know that the "it" is the book of the law, what was the book of the law added to? And we know the book of the law was added because of transgressions. But what was the transgression? Now we're starting to see why we need the education Peter warns is necessary. Because if we don't know what was established in the Old Testament, we'll never be able to properly understand what's being revealed in the New. So let's take a look at what happened at Mount Sinai just before the people were given the book of the law. "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people, and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded back together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. So it's here in Exodus 19 where we read how the people were offered and accepted to hear and obey the Father's covenant. And the definition of the contents of the Father's covenant is given to us in Exodus 31 verse 18, which reads, "When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the covenant law, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God." Now the Father's covenant law goes by many names. It's known as the eternal law, the seed that was cast out by the sower. It's known as the gospel, the good news spoken, the Word of God, as John tells us in his account of the gospel, the law of God, the 10 commandments, or 10 words, and these are just to name a few. The scriptures tell us that it takes 2 or 3 witnesses to establish a matter. So to establish the matter of the Father's covenant law, a second witness can be found in Deuteronomy 5:22, which reads, "These are the commandments the Lord proclaimed in a loud voice to your whole assembly there on the mountain from out of the fire, the cloud, and the deep darkness. And he added nothing more. Then he wrote them on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me." But what happened when the Father cast out the seed, the word that came from his voice? The people rejected the seed because they lacked understanding. And then they demanded another gospel, the word that came from Moses. So without the word of the Father planted in their heart, they relied on their own understanding of worship by building and worshiping a golden calf. But this broke their promise to hear and obey the Father's covenant law. And it was this transgression that caused the Father to give them the temporary covering of the book of the law, which is the Father's covenant law contained in ordinances. So the answer to what the book of the law was added to is the Father's covenant law. And this is why the 10 commandments are contained in both the Father's covenant and the book of the law covenant. So if we paraphrase verse 19 with the information we have so far, it reads like this. "So what purpose does the book of the law serve? The book of the law was added because of transgressions against the Father's covenant. Paul continues verse 19 by writing, "Till the seed should come." So what seed is Paul writing about? Once again, Paul provides the answer to who the seed is just 3 verses earlier in verse 16. The promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. The scripture does not say, "and to seeds," meaning many, but "and to your seed," meaning one, who is Christ. So the seed is Christ, who is the Word that came from the Father, that was cast out at Mount Sinai. And this should bring new understanding to the parable of the sower, because Christ is sharing what happened to the seed, the Word, that was cast out by the Father. So let's add this to what we already have. So what purpose does the book of the law serve? It was added because of transgressions against the Father's covenant, till Christ should come. Then Paul writes, "To whom the promise was made." So what promise was made? And to whom was it made to? Now if you're paying attention, you'll know that the answer to those questions were just uncovered when we found the answer to who the seed was in Galatians 3:16. Paul writes that the promises were made to Abraham and his seed. Paul makes a point to write this because although the promise was made with Abraham, it wasn't ratified with Abraham. And this is another part of the education necessary in order to properly reconcile this verse. So let's explore this in a little more detail. When the covenant with Abraham was ratified, Abraham was in a deep sleep when a smoking firepot and blazing torch, which symbolized the Father and the Son, passed between the animal pieces, ratifying the Father's covenant in spirit. In other words, it was the Father's Word, the Son, that sealed the covenant. The author of the letter to the Hebrews summed it up like this: when God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself. And this is why the book of the law is only a temporary covering that would be in place until the seed, which is Christ, should come, because it would take the blood of Christ to fulfill the Father's promise, which is what Christ tells us in his Sermon on the Mount. Christ tells us he didn't come to abolish the covenant law, he came to fulfill it. And how would Christ fulfill the law? We know that the wages of sin is death, which means the blood of the one who breaks the covenant must be shed. Since it was the Father's Word that ratified the covenant, which is Christ, it's his blood that must be shed. And this offers us just another example of why we need to gain the education Peter warns is necessary, because without it, we'll never be able to understand why it had to be Christ, why he had to die, and how Christ fulfilled the law. The lack of knowledge of these fundamental principles and others is what disqualifies many from the priesthood, yet they pursue it anyway, allowing the enemy to use them to lead others into the error of lawlessness. So let's be sure we're not one of them, because causing a new believer to stumble will have catastrophic consequences. Now remember, we were told by the author of the letter to the Hebrews that the covenant of promise was backed by the word of the Father. But as we read here in Genesis 15:8, Abraham questioned the Father's word. So the Father responded by making a blood covenant with Abraham in which his descendants would be the beneficiaries, which put the life of the Father's word, which is Christ, on the line should the covenant of promise be broken. This answers the question, why Christ? So when the Father's covenant was broken, 2 things had to happen. First, the Word, which was symbolized by the blazing torch, must be cut in 2, just as the animal parts were that they passed through, because this is the consequence for breaking a blood covenant. This is why there are 2 laws. There's the Father's covenant law, which is the word that came from the voice of the Father, and the book of the law, which is the law that came from the voice of Moses, which Paul refers to as the law contained in ordinances. And 2, since the word of the Father, which is Christ, is on the line, in understanding that the wage of sin is death, when the people broke the Father's covenant with their worship of the golden calf, it was the blood of Christ that was required to fulfill the law and why Christ had to die. This is what Paul is trying to communicate to these new believers in Galatia when he wrote, "What I mean is this. The law, introduced 430 years later, does not set aside the covenant previously established by God and thus do away with the promise. For if the inheritance depends on the law, then it no longer depends on the promise. But God, in his grace, gave it to Abraham through a promise." It was their sin on the third day at Mount Sinai that broke the Father's covenant and caused Moses to literally break the stone tablets on which the Father's covenant law was written. But the Father's covenant law is eternal, so Moses was directed to chisel out 2 more tablets just like the first, in which the Father wrote his covenant law, and then they were placed within the ark. This is why Christ said, "No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand, where it gives light to everyone in the house." The light Christ is referring to is the word that came from the Father, the word that the people were to write on their hearts for everyone to see. Instead, they rejected the word, and it was hidden away in the ark. It's these events at Mount Sinai, and the consequences that followed, Paul is trying to explain to these new believers in Galatia, as Paul continues by writing, "And it, which we've established is the book of the law, was appointed through angels." So who was the book of the law appointed through? Paul tells us that the book of the law was not decreed directly to Moses by the Father, but it was given through angels. Paul continues by writing that the book of the law was written by the hand of a mediator. So by whose hand was the book of the law written? It was written by the hands of Moses. We're told this for 2 reasons. The first is to be sure that we know that only the Father's covenant law that was written by the Father is eternal, whereas the book of the law was temporary at the hand of Moses. The second reason is to be sure that we know that the Father's covenant law is mediated by Christ, and the book of the law covenant was mediated by Moses. Now let's read Galatians 3:19 with all the information we learned in place. So what purpose does the book of the law serve? The book of the law was added because of transgressions against the Father's covenant till Christ should come, and the book of the law was decreed through angels by the hand of Moses. So in this single verse, Paul explains how the book of the law, which is the law contained in ordinances, was only a temporary covering that would remain in place until Christ would come to fulfill the law and mediate the Father's covenant to all who would hear and obey the Father's call to come out of her and into the light of the living Word. But let's not miss one very important aspect. Christ was our only hope. If Christ doesn't walk out the book of the law perfectly, he would not be the perfect sacrifice required, and the book of the law would have remained in place forever, because there would no longer be any sacrifice for sin. In other words, we could never have a relationship with the Father, and it would always be about the outward appearance of righteousness through religion. So all praise and honor to the Father, for through the resurrection of His Word, Christ, the promise of the new covenant was ushered in, and the seed, the Father's covenant law, the Word that came from the Father, would be written on the hearts of all those who come out of her and into His light. And this is where we see how the Father's covenant is the law, is the Word, is the seed, is the gospel, is the Christ. And I believe it was with this knowledge and understanding that Isaiah wrote, "The grass withers, the flowers fade, but the word of Yahweh stands forever." And this brings me to a final question. Since Christ has already accomplished all of this, why do we need Him now? And the answer is because the work of Christ in us wasn't finished at the cross. It was only beginning. What was finished was the book of the law covenant, a righteousness of our own strength and understanding, religion. But the Father's law is spiritual, which means it must be mediated through the Spirit, which is Christ, and not the flesh, which was Moses. What Christ offers through His resurrection is a relationship with the Father through Him. For more on this, I invite you to watch our teaching entitled Worshiping in the Spirit and in Truth, where we explore this understanding in detail. We hope this teaching has been helpful in understanding this difficult verse, and the importance of understanding the Old Testament before seeking to understand the New. Thank you, and may you be blessed in your pursuit of truth. Shalom.